Hello and welcome to the Church Communicators Seminar. My name is Christina and I am the Communication Director for the Iowa-Missouri Conference. Today we're going to be covering three topics: writing, social media, and church websites. So I hope you stick around. The first topic that we're going to be discussing today is writing. And there are four main reasons that we as a church and as a conference write. And the first reason is we want to communicate hope. Have you ever been really down or in a hard place in your life, and then you read a story of someone else who maybe went through something similar and they got through it by the grace of God? That's one thing that we want to do, is communicate hope and hopefully uplift other people who might be going through a difficult time. The second thing that we want to do is inspire other churches. A good example of this is actually in our conference. One church heard about another church who was doing a quilt ministry. Now, they had a few people who were passionate about making quilts in their own church, but they didn't know that they could make that into a ministry. After hearing about the other church's ministry, they decided to start their own. And now they have a full ministry where they give quilts to other individuals who might need them. The third reason why we write stories is to create a favorable image of the church to the public. You may have heard the saying that it takes 5 positives to outweigh 1 negative. Well, we want to create a favorable image of the church in the case that something in the past or something in the future might have created a negative taste in someone's mouth. The fourth thing that we want to do is engage community. By writing stories, we can share with the community what we're doing as a church and as a conference, and hopefully get them involved. So now we're going to talk about how you can write your own story. And I'm going to break this down by how many words you're writing. So 100 words or less is really a great way to be on Facebook. Facebook is more of a platform where you want to see pictures and a quick, short summary. If you're writing between 150 to 250 words, this is kind of an awkward length, and it's not really short enough to be on Facebook, but it's not long enough to be a standalone piece on our website. Now, a standalone piece is 300 words or more. And of course, I'm here to help you if this is something that you're interested in getting help with. There's a line that I have created to kind of determine if something goes into Outlook magazine or not. Now, if it's 100 words or less, it's most likely not going to appear in Outlook magazine. However, if it hits that 150 word mark, it might appear in Outlook. Now, you might be wondering, if it's too short for your website as a standalone piece, why could it appear in Outlook? Well, that's because we have to hit a certain number of words to fill a page in a magazine. So for example, if I have a story that's 500 words long and I need 650 words total, a 150 word story is a great place to kind of fill up that space. So those are the reasons why those word counts do work for Outlook, but maybe not a standalone piece. And of course, something to keep in mind is that you always want to have a picture to include with your story. It helps engage people and it helps tell its own story too. Since we talked about Outlook magazine, I just wanted to talk about some deadlines so you can better understand when you should be submitting articles. Outlook articles must be submitted 1 to 2 months in advance. Normally, it takes me 1 week to edit articles, and if a story is more than 3 months old, it loses its relevance. So a good example of this is, let's say a church did something on December 25th for Christmas, and the communication director doesn't get around to writing the story until January 25th. Now they submit that to me, it takes me another week, and then I submit it to Outlook magazine, and it can take up to 2 months for that to be in printed publication, which means by the time that's getting out to the public, we're looking at possibly March or April, which really isn't that relevant. I mean, you might be interested in reading about Christmas in April, but probably not. So there's some writing tips that can help you if you're interested in writing your own story to share on either Facebook, Outlook Magazine, or our own website. The first is to write to an eighth grade education. The reason why we want to write to an eighth grade education level or in simple terms is because it makes it an easier read and more people can understand what you're saying. We also want to be specific. So instead of saying fun was had by all, try including a quote that explains the same thing. So for example, you could say, I had a really fun time at the church party, said Christina Costin, an attendee. It communicates the same message, but we're not generalizing, which means that it's probably more truthful. A great way to elevate your story and make your story more credible is by including more quotes. The more quotes you can get from participants, the better the story is. And lastly, you should never quote yourself. Some more writing tips that we can talk about today are using third person. So in the case that you're writing in a news story style, where maybe you're talking about a church event, you want to use third person. That means that you're avoiding using the word I, we, you, and we're going to try to use words like the church or they. Answering the 6 questions. I have received a lot of stories from various churches, and I think everyone has done a really good job at answering these questions. But as a reminder, those questions are who, what, when, where, why, and how. And if you're looking to write a headline, something that you should consider is including a subject, verb, and object. Now that we've talked about the word count and some writing tips, maybe you want to write, but you're not sure what you can write about. Well, here are some story ideas. The first is a ministry department. This could be prison ministries, women's ministries, men's ministries, etc. You could also do a feature story, and this would include maybe a teacher. Maybe you have someone who was in your church who was a missionary, and they have great missionary stories. Those are all great ideas. And let's say you have a well-known guest speaker come to your church, like Doug Batchelor. That's a great story to include. If you have a specific event, like maybe you did a fundraiser and you handed out food to people in the community, those type of events are very impactful. And if your church is connected to a school, those type of stories tend to get some of the most reads because people in the church love the youth. Speaking of the youth, here is a new genre that I would really like to try to get started on our own website, and that is for young people. The reason I want to start this genre is because a lot of people who leave the church tend to return to the church after they're married and after they have children. And I would like our church to provide resources for these individuals so that they feel like they are being provided for and that their kids have a space that they can grow up in. And to kind of back this up, I have this quote here, and it says, religiosity begins to rise again as young people go through their 30s, coincide with marriage, children, and more stable involvement in specific communities. And that's by Frank Newport, who is a scientist and an author. So if you're interested in writing a story for kids, here are some things to keep in mind. We want it to be a little bit shorter, so about that 300-word mark. And of course, it's aimed towards children. So while earlier we talked about an 8th grade education level, you might be thinking a little bit less than that. And unfortunately, I know we've all heard great stories, but you probably shouldn't be submitting stories that aren't yours. That just helps us avoid copyright issues. And speaking of copyright issues, now it's time to talk about something very fun, which is legal issues. Today, I'm going to be sharing some ways that we can avoid them. And the first is we must have written consent for vulnerable population. Now, a vulnerable population, I have a few examples of them. Now, it's not just limited to these individuals, but this is just to give you an idea. So we have minors, someone who is receiving free services like food, shelter, etc., and someone with a mental or physical handicap. Now, a lot of people have asked, do I need to have a photo release form signed for a child who is baptized? The answer to that question is yes. If you are taking photos of someone who is a minor under the age of 18, you need to have a guardian sign the photo release form, which you can find on our website underneath the communication tab, and then to the left underneath the resource tab. This also applies to individuals who are receiving free services. Now, this is probably going to apply more to Adventist community service centers or services like that. But basically, the reason why we want to do this is because we don't want individuals to feel like they have to take a photo or have a quote about them in order to receive a free service. So whenever you are doing a story about someone receiving free services, you always need to ask if it's okay. And you should always explain that it is not necessary for them to take a photo in order to receive the free service. And as I mentioned earlier, you can find those photo release forms under the communication tab. Let's say that you are on fire for communicating, but you're wearing a lot of hats in the church or in your own personal life, and you just don't have the time to do everything. That's totally okay. I understand. Maybe you might consider expanding your communication team. Now, I would recommend that if you're considering doing this, to reach out to the youth in your church. Growing up, I always wanted to be involved in the church, but I didn't really know how. I didn't see where I fit into the church. Looking back, I think a great way for young people, specifically high schoolers and college-aged young adults, can contribute to the church is by helping in the communication department. These individuals are constantly writing for school, so they already have this skill built up. And a lot of them are using social media in their personal life. So if your struggle is with social media, they can assist you there as well. So that concludes the presentation that I had prepared. And now I just want to answer some questions that some individuals submitted to me. They asked, how do I submit a story? Well, there are two ways that you can submit a story to the Iowa Missouri Conference. The first way is that you can actually email me, which is communication@imsda.org. And this is probably the best way because if there's any questions I have, I can just respond to that email. However, if you'd prefer to fill out the form on our website, you can do that as well. And again, you can find that form on the communication tab. The second question I received was, can you use an iPhone to take images? Yes, you can use any smartphone you have to take images and submit them for a story. However, please keep in mind that the higher the quality of the image, the better, especially if it's going to print with Outlook magazine. So when you're sending me a photo from your smartphone, always make sure to choose the largest size available. Someone else asked me, is it okay to write in first person ever? The answer to that is yes. While earlier I did say third person and specifically said for news stories, first person is appropriate in a few occasions. The first is if someone is giving their own personal testimony. And this is really the most common one where we're going to be using first person. So for example, if I were talking about how I decided to dedicate my life to Jesus, then if I'm personally writing that story, that's a time that I'm going to be using first person. And of course, if you're quoting someone, that quote is also going to be taken from their perspective. So if that individual uses the word I, you're going to want to include that. And the last question I received for the writing section was about group photos and legal issues regarding them. Now, the biggest question here was, we have children in our church, and we have taken group pictures with the children in our church. Do we need to have a photo release form signed for all of those kids? Theoretically, the best thing that you could do is get a photo release form signed by all the parents. However, I recognize that this is probably not going to happen. So what I would recommend doing is verbally explaining to everyone that you're taking a photo and that photo might be shared on social media and other platforms. And this can also apply to if your church does live streaming and you have a children's story. In either case, you probably want to explain that you're taking a group photo and where it will be shared. All right, so now we're going to get into our second topic, which is understanding social media for the church. And to best understand social media, I actually wanted to, first of all, read the definition of social media. Social media is forms of electronic communication, such as websites for social networking and microblogging, through which users create online communities to share information, ideas, personal messages, and other content, such as videos. There are a few different social media platforms that we're going to talk about today. We have Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Now, when considering these different social media platforms, something else we want to consider is the demographic of individuals in the church. Now, I've provided here a graph by age of our conference members. Now, the largest percentage of our conference members are over the age of 30, and the smaller percentage, which I believe is around 16%, is under the age of 30. Keep in mind that to be considered a member, you either have to do a profession of faith or baptism. So just because our under 30s is a small percentage doesn't mean that people under 30 are not attending church. It just means that they haven't either been baptized or done a profession of faith. So we're going to go ahead and jump into our different platforms today, and we're going to start with Facebook. So Facebook is still one of the most widely used social media platforms in the United States, and currently 69% of Americans use Facebook. And that's a large percentage, but an even larger percentage, 81%, use YouTube. Instagram, this is an area where 31.4% of Instagram users are between the ages of 25 to 34. Now, if you watched the section where I talk about writing, I mentioned that around 30 years of age is when people who have left the church start to return to the church. So if you're trying to target a demographic of people who have maybe left the church and they're returning to the church, or a demographic who is maybe newlywed or having children, Instagram is probably the best platform for you. Now, we're going to talk about Twitter. I personally am not a big fan of Twitter. For a conference or church purpose, I feel like the best time to use Twitter is for small communication. For example, let's say there's a snowstorm and you have canceled church. Twitter might be a good place to put that. Of course, I would also recommend putting that on other platforms as well. Now, the newest social media that I'll be talking about today is TikTok. It's currently the most downloaded app. And while it is easy to get many views, it does take a lot of time to create TikToks. So if you're struggling with time and maybe you're trying to manage social media and do other things either in your personal life or for the church, maybe spending more time on various other platforms like Facebook and Instagram might be more beneficial than spending all of your time on TikTok. So, what kind of content should you be posting on social media? Some ideas of things that you should be posting are church services, upcoming church events, church in the news, conference or local, and Bible verses. And to go along with that, the question is, how often should the church be posting? There are conflicting answers to that question. I have been in a seminar where an individual recommended posting 3 times a day. Of course, I don't even have the time to post 3 times a day. And I feel like as a user, someone who's looking through their Facebook page, they maybe don't want to see 3 posts from one individual or one organization. Other individuals recommend posting a lot less, but my advice to you is quite simple. It's to just post consistently with variety. So by consistency, I mean, try to post at least once a week. Don't let your platform go unattended for a long amount of time. And when I mention variety, what I'm saying is don't just post sermons. If someone is looking at your church and they find your social media page, but all they see is sermons, they maybe are not as inclined to do more research and want to check out your church. Now, if your church does activities and you post activities, pictures of those activities on your Facebook page or other social media platforms, people might become more engaged because it's something different than just sermons. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, another thing that you can do to add some variety that maybe wouldn't take very much time is post a Bible verse every now and then. Bigger organizations like It Is Written do this all the time. Now we're going to talk about some specific tips to help you with different social media platforms. And the first one we're going to talk about is YouTube chapters. Now, a lot of churches do post their sermons on YouTube, or they live stream their sermons to YouTube. Well, if you live stream, after the live stream, you can do this, or if you upload, once you upload, you can do this as well. YouTube chapters divides a video into separate sections, so it makes the video easier for a viewer to navigate. So for example, I have an example video here of Gail Corden for 10 days of prayer. Now, at the bar down here at the bottom, you'll notice the first section says intro, and as I move my mouse through this bar, it says schools, 10 days of prayer, and personal story. Now, each of these titles represents what Gail is talking about in these sections of the video. And the way that you do this is very simple. When you have uploaded your video, or once your live stream has finished, you'll go into the description box and you'll put something called timestamps. With the timestamps, you want to put in at what time something occurs. So for example, the intro occurred from 0 seconds to 20 seconds. By indicating that in the description box, YouTube goes ahead and divides the video up for you. So as you can see here, 20 seconds to 31 seconds is schools, and 31 to 2 minutes was 10 days of prayer, and 2 minutes to 3 minutes and 14 seconds is personal story. Let's say I'm only interested in watching the part about schools. If I scroll down to the description box and I press the beginning number for schools, it'll automatically take me to that section. This makes it a lot easier for people to navigate. For example, if you're uploading a church service as a whole, someone can just view the song service, the announcements, or the sermon because it's easily divided and easy to navigate. Now, another tip is to include the location in your post. So this is applicable to a lot of different platforms, including Facebook and Instagram. I believe TikTok does this as well. The reason why we want to include location is because individuals who are in that local community might be suggested your post, or if they're searching for things in the local community, they might see your post. And this is a great way for us to share what we're doing as a church and as a conference with the community. Another recommendation for YouTube is to title your sermons as a question. YouTube is a search engine, and it's the second most used search engine where people are trying to find answers to questions. So they're putting in questions into the search bar in YouTube. And if the title of the sermon matches their question, they're probably more likely to view your video. The last recommendation is to add hashtags to your post. And of course, we have to talk about legal issues again. We talked about this in the writing section, but we're going to talk about it here again. And the main thing is CCLI license. Now, this is actually a link, and if I click this link, it's going to take us here to YouTube. This is a 45-minute long video published by Outlook magazine that does an excellent job of explaining CCLI licenses and live streaming for churches. So I recommend watching that if that's something that you're questioning or interested in learning more about. And of course, again, you need to have a written consent for vulnerable populations, which, as I previously mentioned, is minors, someone receiving free services, or someone with handicaps. And again, you can find a release form for the Iowa-Missouri Conference underneath the communication tab to the left underneath the resource tab. And a lot of times we try to avoid using a minor's last name on social media just because it helps protect the identity of that individual. Here are some free resources to help with social media. The first is Hootsuite. Hootsuite is a scheduler where you can schedule posts in advance. And I have used this for the conference. There's a free version and a paid version. The free version, I believe you can only schedule up to 5 posts in advance. And you can do that on any 2 social media platforms you want. So Twitter and Instagram, Twitter and Facebook, Instagram and Facebook, etc. So the Hootsuite does work. It's very user-friendly and easy. But as I mentioned, there are some limitations because it only allows you to schedule 5 posts for free. If you're interested in simply scheduling posts for Facebook or Instagram, Facebook Publisher is a great option. It allows you to schedule a lot of posts in advance, and I believe that you can schedule posts up to 3 months in advance. So it's very user-friendly, it's a free tool, and it allows you to schedule a lot of posts. The third is more of a template design platform, and that's canva.com. They offer a free version and a paid version. The free version is very user-friendly. They have a lot of stock images and stock videos that you can use. I've never had a problem finding a video or a photo on the free version, and so I don't think it's necessary to purchase the paid version. If you're just learning how to use YouTube, the channel YouTube Creators is a great place to learn some of the basics. Now, the last 3 here are some options for free images where you don't need to give attribution to the website or the individual who took the photo. The question that I received during this seminar was if you can do YouTube chapters or similar feature in Facebook. And the answer to that question is no. To my knowledge, there's no way of creating chapters on Facebook. And another question I received was, can you use YouTube chapters on a YouTube live stream? The answer to that question is yes. However, after the live stream is when you can do that. So once you're done live streaming and the video is uploaded to your channel, you'll have to go back and add in those timestamps we talked about earlier into the description box. The last topic we're going to cover today is church websites, which are provided for free by the North American Division through AdventSource. So this isn't something that the Iowa-Missouri Conference really deals with very much, but there are still a few things that I felt like might be helpful to you. If your church has chosen to use the free website from the North American Division, you're probably going to have on your website the following things: homepage, about us, calendar, ministries, online giving, and contact us. Now, these are all important things that you want to have on your website, but just to double check, please make sure that you have accurate service times, that you have upcoming events that are accurate, and that your ministries page is filled with actual ministries that you have, which could include pathfinders, prayer groups, etc. If you have an empty page on your website, you might want to consider deleting it. It can be really frustrating to individuals who are trying to learn more about the church, only to find that they've been taken to a blank page. I wanted to share this example of 2 different calendars from 2 different churches. Now, this is really important to me because as the conference communication director, I often go to churches' websites to try to see if there are any upcoming events. But a lot of times I don't find adequate information to tell me when, where, and what something is. So if you're in charge of your church's website, you might want to ask yourself, if I was a visitor, would I be able to obtain enough information to determine if I want to and if I can go to an event? So I've given on the screen here 2 different examples. On the left, you can see a church has something called creative exercise. Now, We don't know what this is. There's no description. We know what time it is and we know where it is, but it's a little confusing because it's at the Baptist church and this is the Adventist church. And because I don't know what the creative exercise is, I'm a little lost. Is creative exercise writing exercise? Is it physical exercise? We're not really sure. So I actually contacted this church, and the person I spoke to said, "Oh, we don't do that anymore." So if it's something that your church is no longer doing, please make sure to remove that. And if it is something you're doing and it doesn't provide a good description, try to include that description so visitors can understand better what your church is doing. Now, on the right is a better example of how you can put something into your calendar. So as you can see here, it gives the time. And while it doesn't give the location, it does say to be announced, but it gives an explanation of what the discipleship class is. As I mentioned earlier, the church websites are provided through the North American Division and through Advent Source. So if you have any questions, you want to contact Advent Source directly, which their information is here on the screen. I hope you all found this seminar helpful, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.